You can get started, Brian.
Okay. Welcome everybody to today's Behavioral Health Echo, Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance. We are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal affiliation, job title, and organization. Everyone will be muted until the participant reflections portion of the hour. During that segment, use the raise your hand icon on Zoom, and the host will unmute you to offer your reflection. And you will receive a link to the recording and presentation by the end of the week. And continuing education credit information. This activity is jointly provided by USET and Cardia Services to offer one AMA PRA category 1 credit, one nursing credit, one counseling credit, and one social work credit. And upon completion of this activity, in order to complete this activity, you must complete the entire session, attend the entire session, complete the online evaluation, and submit the online CE request within 2 weeks of the event, which is just finishing out the evaluation and submitting it there. If you have any questions, please contact myself or Paige O'Sullivan at Cardia Services. Her email address is on the screen. And there are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Takue Ayase. Thanks for welcoming back to our series. Thanks for joining us today. I am Bernice Jordan. I am a citizen of Fort Peck Sioux Nation. I'm one of the public health program managers here at USET. Next slide, Brian. So to learn and acknowledge what tribal nation land you are on, organization you're standing on, you can go ahead and go to this website or text your zip code to this number. Next slide. So I want to go ahead and introduce our next two speakers. This series or this session will be on healing Native family trauma related to drugs and alcohol, part 2. I know some of you were with us last month. I am introducing Dr. Art Martinez and Holly Echo Hawk. If you want to go ahead and take it from here, Holly.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Good to see you again. I'm Holly Echo Hawk. I'm the Senior Behavioral Health Advisor for several different entities, including the Senior Behavioral Health Advisor for this wonderful series, Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance. It's great to see everybody signing in. Folks from Navajo, Passamaquoddy are good friends, Warm Springs, Cowlitz in Washington State, folks from Minneapolis, DC, UMass Boston, welcome, Squamish, Anchorage. As you can see, we are lucky to have you all with us. So continue to introduce yourself. We are glad you enjoyed the music. We pick each song very carefully, and it's another example of brilliance in Native music. So go to the next slide. This is part 2, and if you were with us last month, great. If you weren't, you could access the part 1 if you want. But I'm going to give you a brief recap of what we did last month for part 1. So the next slide. So we did several things last month on this topic of healing Native family trauma related to drugs and alcohol. So last month, Dr. Martinez was with us. Yay. And we did several things. So we talked about trauma experiences that disrupt Native family functioning. We talked about different types of trauma, both experienced and witnessed, and trauma reactions. Of course, we always talk about the innate strengths and intelligence that Native people have, but that gets compromised at times by episodes of alcohol and drug and the behavior that emerges from that. We briefly talked about ACE scores, and noted that higher ACE scores for Indigenous people is associated with increased rates of suicide and psychological distress. You might remember we had that graphic of a brain, and we illustrated how substance use impacts brain functioning and behavior. So it's not just a matter of will. Won't that so-and-so just straighten up? Not that simple. We wish it was. We also briefly talked about post-traumatic growth, one of my favorite conversations. And we gave some examples of how Native communities are resisting substance use in their community. Then we ended with a question and answer fireside chat with Dr. Martinez. So that was last month. And the next slide, just a reminder that there's really complicated reasons for alcohol and drug use. Dr. Martinez will talk about the relationship between increased vulnerability and traumatic events, and how critical it is to not just focus on addiction, but to stop the trauma. And then, of course, we all are very painfully aware of the influx of opiates, fentanyl, methamphetamines, and now xylazine into our communities. So makes things even more complicated. Next slide. And just a reminder that trauma can actually occur while someone's in recovery. Someone you love and care about who has slipped into an addiction world, even when they're in recovery, trauma can still happen. And just a reminder that of the 4 NIDA big stages of recovery, the one that can be the stage of recovery that can have potential to be more unsafe and more out of control for families is early recovery, early abstinence. And there's reasons for that, including it's a very tough stage to cope. And when you're in that stage, you're still experiencing cravings, social pressure to go back to the addiction situation and be involved in high-risk situations that could trigger starting to use again. So next slide. So today, part 2, we have the great honor of having Dr. Art Martinez with us again. So today we're going to talk about a few things. One is that trauma and drug and alcohol use can definitely, and we all know this, and some of us have had personal experience, we know it can disrupt healthy Native functioning. However, we can build on family strengths to heal the relationships that are strained, family relationships that are strained from drug and alcohol use. And we will discuss ways to repair relationships and reclaim healthy Native families. So the next slide is going straight into the introduction with Dr. Martinez and my good friend Art. And Art and I have known each other for many decades, probably at least 3. He's just, I really enjoy being around people that are not only native speak, native perspective, everything they do is from a native lens, but also very well trained as a clinician and as a psychologist. So with that, I will let Dr. Martinez introduce himself, and then we'll go from there. So thank you all so much.
All right, thank you, Holly. Cool, everyone. My name's Art Martinez. I'm Chumash. I'm a consulting psychologist assisting. I've been fortunate enough to assist many tribes throughout the years and served in many capacities. As you can see, I've been a senior advisor with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes and director of the Center for Native Child and Family Resilience. But in addition to those kind of extracurricular activities, I've spent 40 years as a clinician and as an expert witness in child welfare cases, and specializing not only in the treatment of addiction through my APA certification as an addiction certified as in addiction services, but also as someone who is certified in the treatment of trauma. So as many of you are involved in the treatment of both trauma and be it trauma, be it intergenerational trauma, be it recovery, or even active addiction with the clients that you see, I hope that what we talk about today might stimulate some thoughts, might stimulate some conversation about the dance or the coexistence of most of these issues that exist with probably the clients that we see. It is very likely that the clients that you see, because they are high risk, have had direct experiences of trauma, but it's also likely that that sits on a foundation of intergenerational trauma that many of our people have experienced and continue to experience. So with that, I think we can just go to the next slide and maybe begin our discussion. Did you want to take us through this, Holly?
Sure. One of the things that, conventional mainstream treatment for someone that's in active addiction tends to be very individualized, but that's not the native approach. But we just wanted to kind of illustrate that people that are in active addiction have lots of other challenges in addition to their addiction, all related, not having any work or sporadic work, having to go to court often, frequently have lost their driver's license. If they were in school, that could, definitely was interrupted often, really careless with their health, their own health and well-being. Their physical health declines, and of course, avoiding problems. And those are just some of many aspects that affect someone that is in and living in an addiction world. But it also affects family members. And you all know this from your work, and maybe even if you have personal experience in your community or in your family, the family members get impacted too. Their work is interrupted. They often have to take time off work to go to drive somebody they love to court. They really worry about how different fines are going to be paid. Their own education might be interrupted. They worry about health safety. They worry about their loved one being careless and putting themselves in risky situations. They also can see visually if their loved one's health is declining. They worry about that. And instead of avoiding problems, sometimes they start masking the problems. They're just often overwhelmed and not sure what to do. And I'm fairly certain that all of you all on the call have seen that frustration and pain and fear that family members have, that they don't know what to do. So the next slide. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe we could just talk about, talk about that for just a second, particularly in that area that you talked about at the end there, where family members tend to mask issues that are going on. It's important to understand that, while we know the person who is in active addiction has a tremendous denial system that stems from their an attempt to present themselves as not having issues, basically. That also bleeds over into the family. So that the denial system of the individual is very strong. Sometimes the denial system of the family is even stronger. And that plays into the active addiction and the way that addiction expresses itself within the family. Oftentimes we say that while the individual suffers from their addiction, the family carries the entire burden of their addiction and their the missteps in life that have been taken. So that we often see that translated as kind of an imbalance of power, so that the power is held by the person with the addiction in many ways, and then the family members are trying to acquiesce, make things better, accommodate sometimes the person in active addiction, and in an effort to try to make things better, whatever that might be. But they it often doesn't get us to the solutions that we want to arrive at as family.
Yeah, that's a great point, Art. And that concept of denial, or the really, I guess not a concept, but reality of denial system, that intense denial can bleed over to the family. And thank you all for putting things into the chat. Please continue to do that in response to what you all see. If these are just a partial list, but there's other things that you all are seeing. And I remember one thing, I'll just mention this real quick. A friend of mine who was living in an addiction world went to prison for 7 years. And his sister said, when brother got sent to prison for 7 years, I got sent to prison for 7 years, meaning that she had to carry the family without his help for those 7 years, and take care of an elderly mom and dad and all of that. So I thought that was a really incredible statement that she made. Shall we move on to the next slide? So the next one.
So would you like me to talk about this one?
Yes, I would. I would love for you to talk about this.
Okay.
My friend.
Well, there's a real dance that occurs between the coexistence of trauma and substance use, and addiction. So there's substance use, the addictive process, as we know, there's a fine line sometimes between the substance use and an addictive process. But that is sometimes overladen by different types of trauma, complex trauma, lateral violence, historical trauma, and then direct experiences of trauma. So it's important to understand that at a point where someone engages themselves in treatment, whether it be from what they might define as substance use or abuse or addiction, when someone engages in that, it is hard to tell whether that addiction process or that use process that they have is in response to a traumatic event or a traumatic history. So in other words, whether it's a symptom of trauma, or whether they may have had traumatic experiences while using. And so it's very, as many of you know, it's very important to reach a point of stability. Oftentimes we find that people are searching for that stability. That may be what gets them into treatment, and that's good. But it's important to be attentive to that stability also. So they may have burned bridges with their family, or they may have just disconnected themselves from even caring about their family. They may be focused only on themselves, and at that point, we begin the process of treatment wherever they are. So you kind of meet them where they are. And that cycle of addiction becomes very self-serving. So it's very easy to see that the person as being selfish in their needs, or self-centered and so forth. But truly, in early recovery, many of the folks that we see are kind of reaching out for a lifesaver, if you will. And yes, that's self-serving, but it kind of speaks to the desperation that they're feeling, because all of the things that supported their addiction or the support system that they had, those bridges are all beginning to burn around them. And so they're trying to find a way out. And the great advantage to that is that they have, for whatever reasons, turned to treatment as that way out. So it's important to engage them and also reinforce them for taking that step, because it's a very brave step to take. So someone who's in an active cycle of addiction, as we know, they have many issues, some of which are listed here. Inappropriate, showing up in inappropriate ways to family or community events, being moody, irritable, angry. And it's important to understand that there is it is so many times addiction is so intertwined with trauma that we really don't know where one begins and the other ends. But some of these symptoms that you see here are very similar to things that we see with people who have trauma response. So let me talk about trauma response a little bit. A trauma response is a reactivity to trauma. Let's think of it that way, very simply. And sometimes we even say trauma reactive. But importantly, a direct experience of trauma means that the person has had a direct experience of something that they perceived as life-threatening, or was probably in fact life-threatening. And so that response takes them to a place of having a lot of anger, a lot of irritability, and a lot of tremendous feelings of being driven inward, that they really don't have power to control it. So whatever resources they had within themselves, they were not able to prevent it from happening or to make it stop. And so at that time, we become very good at having an internal response of just checking out. Sometimes that takes on hallucinations. Sometimes it takes on psychotic symptoms in response to trauma. Sometimes it takes on the issue of you'll see people often check out. And so all of those things are important to make note of, because it will help us later on by defining their responses to trauma and their responses to addiction, to begin to ferret out the differences that may have been caused by the addiction. So the addictive process, of course, itself can cause neurological damage and emotional decays, so that there are parts of that come from the addictive process. There are many parts of that could come from trauma experiences, and then there are parts of that can come from historical trauma or complex trauma that has operated maybe throughout their life. So this can lead families to a feeling where, particularly in the family, that they feel like there's no safe place. And so we see that quite a bit with people and family members who feel like they are somehow fundamentally flawed, and that there's something that they're the family to blame. They're the family that gets treated poorly within the community. They're the family that that people have kind of given up on over the years. And so they feel like this is just a place in life. What we find is that those families, and maybe many times these are the families we worry about, and maybe hard to serve. What we do find, though, is that with those families, those families oftentimes have experienced all of these levels of multi-generational trauma that we see. So we know that there have been various layers with each generation since the time of contact. each generation has had specific traumatic events that to some extent continue today, whether it be, forms of genocide, being removed to boarding schools, being hunted for bounty, being enslaved, any number of activities that have focused on pulling the strength from Native families. And so what we'll see is that many of these families that somehow feel like there's no hope in some ways, that they have experienced every level of those traumas. Some families have, for whatever reasons, found a way to sidestep some of them. I call it sidestepping the landmines. They found a way through their culture, through their ways, sometimes just through isolation, to avoid some of those impacts. And so the families that didn't or that couldn't, they are oftentimes the families that we see that have deteriorated over time. So a large part of building that strength is boundaries, as someone mentioned, I think. So establishing the healthy boundaries within the family might be a new experience, but it's a place of finding stability. So it allows us to find that level of stability that we can build on the strengths of family. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, and here's our fire.
Yes, there's our fire. And we have a series of questions for Dr. Martinez. And thank you for the explanation of that chart. Before I go to the questions, the other thing that chart was illustrating is on the left side are kind of common situations, characteristics for any person that's in the addiction world. And then the other arrow at the top was showing that. But for Native people, you have these other complicating factors, which you talked about. And those combined really create a negative firestorm at times. So thank you for all that discussion. So the next slide in our campfire chat is a question for Dr. Martinez. So how can family members address their own feelings of fear, guilt, or shame related to the situation of having someone that they, in their family, they care about, that's in the addiction world?
Yeah, well, the to a large extent, the family members may actually feel these very issues that are listed here, and then some. They may feel those more than the person who's living the addiction. Some of that is through a codependent process, but a lot of it also is through their own feelings that have been elicited by the environment that they live in, the community they live in, that they feel it comes from a foundation of not feeling safe. So when we don't feel safe, we feel that everything's our fault. And in addiction, as it impacts the family, family safety is one of the first things to go. So there's fear, there's guilt, and there's shame. All of those are very foundational that lead to many other issues that branch out into everything from low self-esteem to oftentimes we see perfectionism, obsessive compulsive behaviors, any number of responses that the individual family members might take to this feeling of you can't trust and you can't talk, I think is what one of the authors, I'm forgetting her name right now. Claudia Black wrote about many years ago. So the foundation of a family stands upon its ability to be safe together, to be trusting of one another, to exchange and to communicate love in a very genuine way. And an ability to teach and collaborate with one another. And what we find is that all of those things, while they're not completely absent in families of addiction, they've been translated around, trying to work around and the issues of lack of safety, lack of trust, all of that. So you find these strategies that the only thing we know is that they don't tend to work well because they're not admitting to the actual lack of safety, lack of love, lack of trust, and so forth. So as we begin to regroup around that, we want to build strength of the family. We could talk about the issues that make the family weak for quite a while and not never make them stronger. What we do is we begin with very simple participations of healing the family. And some of that comes importantly through ceremony, through participation in wellness activities, cultural activities, and as much as is possible, Al-Anon or other family strengthening activities. Now, sometimes people will say, how does that then change the addiction or the addict? Well, it may not change the addict, but the family strength is something to be attentive to. And so in some ways you're treating the person who shows up. So if the family shows up, fine, we'll treat that. We'll treat them. If the person with the addiction shows up, we'll treat them. And I'll just exchange a story one time that I often use is, and this was a fairly common experience of mine a while back, not as much anymore because I'm not doing direct treatment as much anymore. But I would typically have family members that would come to me. Could be the wife, it could be the wife bringing in the children because they're acting out problems in school and so forth. And we would kind of hone down some of the family issues to an addictive process with one of the family members. And what we would do is say, well, let's just commit ourselves to 6 months, let's say, of strength building. Counseling will be a part of that, but there will be other things that will be a part of that. An array of wellness activities, skill building, in understanding how addiction impacts the family and impacts our relationships with one another. Possibly participation in groups like Al-Anon or family wellness groups, any number of groups like the family strengthening groups that are becoming more available, such as fatherhood programs and child programs. So as we begin to do that, what we find is that now we're paying attention to building health and wellness within the family. And what will happen is that with that comes a loss of power or at least at some level, on the addict's part. And so I would often have the experience of maybe 6 months down the road or a few months down the road, we would be having our family therapy session and for whatever reasons, this was typically the wife or the mother in the situation. And they would say, well, my husband or my son wants to come to the next session. Would that be okay? And, well, sure, of course. He's a part of this family. We need him here. And the first question I would ask him is that, when was the last time you used? And they would often say at that point, it's probably been a month or so. And I would ask the family, to verify that. Is that what you've seen? Does it seem like, and they oftentimes would say, yeah, it seems like he's been home more. He's been, more doing things around the home or doing more involved in family anyway. And I'd say, so you stopped drinking, that's great. Or you stopped using, that's great. But what I want to know is why. You seem to be so involved in it before. Why now? And they would always say the same thing. They would say, it's just not fun anymore. It's just, I just feel bad, when I use. And what they're expressing is that they're no longer the center of attention in the family. They're no longer, that addiction is no longer being attended to. So therefore they're living it on their own. So they're truly living their own nightmare at that point. And that they're beginning to realize it's not fun. So they begin to stop using in their own ways. And then we, of course, talk about recovery and recovery services for them. So
Well,
those are just some ways.
That's incredible. That's wonderful. Thank you for saying all that. And we have 3 other questions, so we're going to skip ahead to that. But I just wanted to say that that example you gave of 6 months, let's do 6 months of wellness, and just helping the family move out of that chaotic environment that they're normally in, with all attention on the person that's living in the addiction world, and building their own strength with a little help and support. Why don't you try this or that or whatever? That, just think what 6 months, and I know you've seen this happen all the time. It sounds simple, but 6 months of directed wellness, it's dramatic change, I can imagine. So thank you for sharing that. Let's go to the next question. Oh, do you have something else?
Well, just importantly, they begin to identify with a different community too. A community of wellness, a community of ceremony, and a community of tradition.
Wonderful. Question number 2. If a person using alcohol or drugs is family violent, what steps should families take?
Well, of course, what we want to do is build safety, and that this can happen. So this is whether the person's using or not using. Actually, they can be violent, and so we want to build safety mechanisms with the family. So how do we find safety? So that can mean in some cases that the person can no longer stay there because they've been violent. In some cases it will mean that the involvement of domestic violence advocates and therapists, or the response of law enforcement. And so in all of these acting out behaviors, violent acting out behaviors, it's important that the family has with them some tools of how to respond to it, how to create safety amongst themselves, and how to keep everyone safe. And some of that comes from practice, knowing so that everyone kind of knows what to do. It's a little bit of a fire drill. And some of it actually comes from the healing that happens when we begin to find safety within our families and begin to build on that. Then we find a point of safety where more information begins to come out that, yes, maybe this has been going on for quite some time. Maybe there are other forms of abuse or violence that have been going on. Importantly, there just in the cases that I treat because of my specialty in the world, you'll find that the family has oftentimes avoided telling anyone of the issues. It's been the family's secret for a very specific reason. And that is that they're afraid that Child Protective Services or some other authority might get involved in their life. They know that leads to not a great place, or it has its own set of risks. So then it makes while the family doesn't feel safe, they feel even less safe if they were to tell someone. So what I do is first of all, I first let folks know that I have an obligation to report child abuse and child endangerment when I see it. But I also tell them that one thing that I practice as much as is possible is that I never want to talk about you without you. So I'm obligated to call, in some cases, tribal child protective services, or maybe it might be county or state child protective services. But I'm not really about me having a conversation with them. I know them. So, I don't need to know them any better. But I would like to involve them in your care. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to call them right now while you're sitting here in the room. We're going to call them and we're going to talk about how they might be able to provide services that they probably will want to come out and talk to you. If you'd like, we can set it up where we talk to them together. I can certainly be a part of that. And then we're going to agree upon a response set. So how are we going to go forward with this so that everyone's safe within the family? And so so I called the Child Protective Services line when needed, right there. And I introduced them to each other and I talk about, just briefly some of the issues that have been going on, and that we want to not only make them aware of the issues that are going on, but more importantly, to seek some services in addressing these issues within the family. So because you're in a therapeutic position, that is a much better forecast, if you will. It's a much better way of approaching child protective services than to have someone report it in the community or the school or so forth. Because it tells child protective services that the family has already taken steps toward healing, and that what they need is support, not investigation or so.
Right.
I mean, while there always will be investigation, but not to be the adversary.
Right, not be punitive.
Right.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions, and then we only have like less than 5 minutes for these next 2 questions. So we'll see if we can get through them. And then,
Okay.
then we'll take some questions from the chat, and then we close with our music. So, so here's another question. How can family members begin to heal even if the person using is not ready to begin their own healing journey? And I think you spoke to this in part already.
Yeah, I did. And just very, very simply, though, it's that they build upon that strength that we talked about earlier, but they begin to find their own identity rather than an identity of family that's dictated by the addiction, an identity that is founded in traditions of family wellness that come from culture, that come from cultural participation, and that come from family healing efforts.
That's wonderful. Thank you for saying that. And you have a way, Art, my friend, of taking very complex, painful situations, and you have such a calming approach to it, but you also really focus on strengths and really focus on kind of changing the environment, and this helping families begin to find their own identity and their own strengths is just very exciting. And I hope all of the folks on listening to you, if they're not already taking that approach, that they do follow that. So we have one last question, which is, what do emotionally healthy Native families do well? We always like to stay with the strength base.
Yeah, when emotionally healthy Native families, what they do well is they do things together well. So I'd venture that that's a very cultural way that we have to do things well as family and as extended family. I don't really have another cultural experience to say whether that's true for just natives or not. And maybe it's true for everyone. I grew up thinking it was true for everyone. I think that as people are emotionally healthy and they do things well together, that takes on then doing things in a healthy way together. So doing healthy things in a healthy way. And within our communities, that generally will point toward community wellness activities. Oftentimes sports will be a part of that. And oftentimes participation in cultural activities or ceremonies will be a part of that. And what we'll find is that if you step back a little bit, what you see is that those families are now engaged in a community of people. So they're not isolated, and they're in a community of wellness. And that's really where the change begins to happen. They begin to identify as a family of wellness. And with that, then they don't tolerate things that take them away from that. So sometimes that is a family in recovery, but sometimes it's just a family that's very culturally strong for their community. It's the same community.
That's great. Thank you. Those were great questions, and I want to thank Jen Downs from Indian Health Service, the Nashville area, for submitting those questions for us this time. Thank you, Jen. We just have a couple of slides in closing, and then Bernice is going to pull some questions from the chat for you. And then we try to leave in a few minutes at the top, before the top of the hour, to listen to our second music venue. So this is a slide of just kind of the summation of what you talked about: building a support network, the role of ceremony. You gave some examples of how people can work through their own emotions and resentments, and gave some really good examples of your professional guidance. Healing together was a theme that you talked about, as well as accessing community wellness resources. And there are many, many. We just listed a couple there. So the next slide. And you all will receive this, both the PowerPoint and the recording, within a few days. So we included some tribal family healing resources, and you can see them listed there. Dr. Martinez is part of the Native Dads Network, which is a new group that I'm really pleased to share their website with everyone. We also listed some family healing program examples. The one that we know of, and Cassandra from Indian Health Service, thank you for trying to help me expand this resource list. The Old Minto Family Recovery Camp in Alaska treats entire families. They all get on a boat, go upriver to a camp where they live, and all family members that want to be there are all there together. And then the other examples that Art was part of, especially the bottom one, which is where his former position was at. Great websites, great information. for you all. And then I think we're going to Bernice now. So next slide. Yep.
I'm back again, Bernice Jordan. I'm just going to pick out a couple of questions that are in the chat. There has been a lot of questions and people have been talking to each other. So great responses. One of the questions are, how do you balance being supportive but not enabling their behaviors? Could either one of you answer that? Dr. Martinez?
Well, yeah, I could take a shot at that. It is very important to have good boundaries, obviously, with the families that we work with. So, and to also understand that families suffering from addiction have very powerful systems. So they're very powerful in their needs, but they're also very powerful in that you can get sucked into the needs or the codependent dependent system that operates there. So boundaries are very, very important. Now that is important also because we can overemphasize boundaries, and so it's a dance we also need to play. For instance, if I'm involved with a family, I want to encourage them to be involved in wellness activities, maybe other things that are going to be helpful for their family. And it's going to be important for us to have healthy boundaries and that at some level of separation, because I want them to truly participate in the community and the wellness activities on their own. And so the thing that makes that oftentimes hard as Native providers is that in many of these activities, ceremonies, whatever they might be, I also might be there. And that would be fine. I will introduce them as friends of mine and so forth, acquaintances, close in the community, and so that they feel comfortable. But I'm going to allow them to then kind of explore their own wellness. The same is true with other providers. I'm going to do warm handovers to people I trust that will treat them well, and that we're all going to work on our boundaries together for this family. So having those boundaries is important. It's much harder to do because as a Native person, because we're going to have community experiences together. And so at times I will even forecast that for the family. So I'll say, there's this big family wellness event. I want you to participate in it, but I don't want you to, I want you to experience it on your own. I'm not going to acknowledge you unless you acknowledge me. And I'm going to refer to you as my friend or relative. So.
Yeah. So we have a couple others in the chat. Kristen Sundin, she said, I like the holistic approach, which focuses not just on the addiction per se, but wellness in general, which Dr. Martinez addresses, which is why I think as a non-Native person that the Native community or village can be so important in a community member's recovery. Marie said, I used to have clients call. I never made a report. It was always my clients. Nora said, it is hard when the violent addict is a family member. I find it hard to get the support I need as an elder and professional. My community doesn't understand addiction, my related mental health issues such as bipolar. There is no follow through for the client in my experience and as a community. I observed this while working rural Alaska and with Native Alaskan people. Yeah, so Margaret said, wonderful presentation. Thank you. So simple and yet profound. Cassandra said, motherhood and fatherhood are sacred and it's also a great resource. And then the last, how do you balance being supportive but not enabling their behaviors? So there's a lot of correspondence on that one.
It's great. Um, and we hope that this monthly series provides some support and some ideas. And so we encourage you to continue to join us every month. We are so happy you're with us today, and we keep it to 1 hour because that's the best fit for people's busy schedules. But we hope you find support and comfort and ideas from our series, and especially from Dr. Martinez, who we can't thank enough for joining us again for this wonderful discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you for all your efforts.
And now there's a continuing CEU information Brian's going to touch base on, I think.
Yes, don't forget to complete your survey. It's on the screen. The link is on the screen as well as in the chat. So please feel free to complete that survey. If you have any questions, please contact Bernice, Jordan, or myself.
And I guess the last slide, Holly, see you in July, same time on the 4th Tuesday, July 25th. Topic, Native Crisis Response, Treble 988 Successes and Challenges.
Yeah, that's great. So stay tuned for that. We'll have the Washington State folks back to tell us how their launch went, and especially the training that they provided in crisis response to the Native at their Native call center. So that'll be great. And we'll close out with another music venue. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for your important work.
That was fantastic. I love Connor Cheat. Well, hope you all enjoyed that. Have a great day. Oh, have a brilliant day. See you next time.